Victor Hale didn't knock. He never knocked. He rode into the yard at mid-morning with two men flanking him like he owned the ground his horse stood on. And the way he looked around, slow and satisfied, made clear he believed he already did. He pulled a folded document from his coat and held it up where the whole street could see, his voice carrying like a man who'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror. "Clara Whitmore," he called out, loud enough for the neighbors to stop and turn. "Your husband's been in the ground 4 months. You've got 30 days to vacate, or I'll have the sheriff remove you and those children myself." He was smiling when he said it. If you've ever watched someone try to take everything from a woman who has nothing left to lose, stay with me. Because what Clara did next, and what a quiet stranger offered her that changed the entire fight, is a story worth seeing through to the end. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Victor Hale rode into Burnt Creek had started like every other morning Clara Whitmore had survived since February, badly and too early. She was at the pump before sunrise, her hands already cracked from the cold that wouldn't fully release its grip even in late April. The bucket was heavy and the handle stiff, and she worked it with her shoulder the way she'd learned to work everything since Thomas died, using the wrong muscle because the right one had given out weeks ago. The water came up gray, and she let it run until it cleared, watching the thin light come up over the ridge to the east. Luke was already in the barn. She could hear him, or rather she could hear the particular silence of a 12-year-old boy doing chores without being asked, which was its own kind of sound. Annie was still asleep. At 9, Annie could sleep through anything, and Clara had stopped waking her early. Let her have the mornings a little longer. The days were hard enough. Clara carried the bucket back to the house, filled the pot, and set it on the stove. She had cornmeal left and half a jar of rendered lard, and she was already calculating. The way she calculated everything now, every meal, every board, every nail, whether what she had would stretch to the end of the week. It probably would. Probably. She heard the horses before she saw them. Not one horse, multiple. And moving with the kind of deliberate, unhurried pace that meant whoever was riding wasn't worried about what they'd find when they arrived. Clara set down the pot. She didn't go to the window right away. She stood in the middle of her kitchen for a moment because she already knew, not who it was exactly, but what it was. She'd known it was coming. Thomas had known it before he died, though he'd never said it directly. He'd just looked at her one night near the end and said, "Don't let Victor near the deed." And then he'd coughed for a long time, and she'd held his hand, and that was the closest they'd come to discussing what would happen after. She went to the window. Victor Hale sat on a gray horse that cost more than Clara's roof. He was Thomas's older brother by 11 years, and he looked it, heavy through the chest now, with a face that had settled into something between authority and contempt. He'd come to the funeral and stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands and said all the right things, and Clara had watched him the whole time and felt nothing she could name clearly except caution. He had 2 men with him. She didn't recognize either of them. One wore a leather vest and kept his hand near his belt. The other held a leather satchel across his saddle like he was carrying something important. Clara dried her hands on her apron and walked outside. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. Thomas had always said that the way you walked toward something told everyone watching whether you were afraid of it, and she'd learned in 4 months of being alone that how you carried yourself was sometimes the only protection you had. "Victor," she said, stopping at the edge of the porch steps. He looked at her the way men like him looked at things they'd already decided belonged to them. Appraising, not greeting. "Clara." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, and he held it up, but not toward her, toward the street, like he wanted witnesses. Because there were witnesses. She hadn't noticed at first, but people had stopped. Old Harmon from the feed store stood in his doorway. The Delacroix woman had come out of the dry goods with a package under her arm and hadn't moved. A boy she didn't know had climbed up on a fence post to see better. Victor's voice went up when he spoke next, pitched for all of them. "Your husband's been in the ground 4 months," he said. "This property was deeded to Thomas Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore is deceased. As his closest living male relative, I have legal standing to contest the transfer of this land. The document I'm holding gives you 30 days to vacate." He paused, let that sit. "Or I'll have the sheriff remove you and those children myself." He was smiling. Clara stood very still. Her hands were at her sides. She could feel her heart going, but she kept her face quiet because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her face change. "That document," she said, "is not a court order." Something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like the slight irritation of a man who expected the rabbit to run and found it sitting there instead. "It doesn't need to be yet." "Then you can take it back where you got it made." She held his gaze. "This land was worked by me and my husband, and it passes to me and my children. That's what Thomas wanted. That's what's right." What Thomas wanted doesn't carry a lot of legal weight in the territory. He folded the document and put it back in his coat, slow and deliberate. A widow alone doesn't have automatic right of inheritance on a contested deed. The land office knows that. I've already spoken to them. The man with the satchel shifted in his saddle. Clara said, "Then I'll speak to them too." Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out at the people watching, at Harmon, at the Delacroix woman, at the boy on the fence post, and his expression said something she couldn't quite read, like he was making a calculation. "You've got 30 days, he said. "Think hard about whether a fight is what's best for those kids." He turned his horse and rode back down the main street at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived with, the two men falling in behind him, and Clara stood on her porch steps and watched him go and did not move until the sound of hooves faded. Then she sat down on the top step. Not because she was giving up. She sat down because her legs had decided the performance was over and they were going to shake whether she liked it or not, and she'd rather be sitting when that happened. She put her elbows on her knees and pressed her fingers against her eyes and breathed through her nose and counted, the way she'd been counting things since Thomas died. Days. Meals, fence posts, nails, whatever needed counting to keep the panic from spreading into the places where the thinking happened. 30 days. She had 30 days and no lawyer and no money to hire one in a land office that, according to Victor Hale, had already heard his side of things. "Mama?" She looked up. Luke was standing in the barn doorway, still holding the feed bucket. He'd heard, of course he had. Sound carried out here. That was one of the things about frontier life nobody told you before you came. That privacy was mostly a city idea, and everything you said out of doors was more or less a public statement. His face was tight, 12 years old and trying to look like he wasn't scared, which made him look more like Thomas than Clara could usually stand to see. "I heard what he said," Luke told her. "I know." "Can he really do that? Make us leave?" Clara stood up. She smoothed her apron. "He thinks he can," she said. "We're going to find out if he's right." Luke stared at her for a moment, then he nodded once. That particular nod, short and decided, that Thomas used to do when he'd settled something in his mind. Clara watched it happen on her son's face and felt something tear open quietly behind her sternum and then close again just as quietly because she didn't have time for it. "Feed the horses," she said, "and check the water trough. I think the east side's got a leak." He went. She went back inside. She stood at the table and picked up the pot she'd put down and set it on the stove and tried to think. The thing was, she did have documentation. Thomas had been careful, more careful than most men out here, who trusted handshakes and memory more than paper. He'd recorded the homestead claim through the proper land office process, and she had a copy of the filing in the tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom. She had records of the improvements, the well they'd dug in the second year, the barn roof they'd replaced, the fence line they'd extended north. Thomas had kept a ledger. She kept it now. But Victor had said he'd already talked to the land office. That was the part that scared her. Not him. Not his money, or his men, or his theatrical display on her front street. It was the idea that the machinery was already in motion before she knew the fight had started, that he'd had conversations she hadn't been present for, that somewhere there were already people who'd nodded along while Victor Hale explained why a widow woman alone wasn't capable of holding a frontier claim. She needed someone to tell her what the law actually said, not what Victor said it said. She needed a lawyer, and she had $11.40 to her name. She went to town that afternoon, leaving Luke in charge and telling him she'd be back before dark. She walked. Couldn't afford to spend the energy on the horse, not with the fence work still needing doing, and Luke not strong enough yet to manage the plow alone. The town of Burnt Creek was not a large place. It had a main street with the necessities, a feed store, a dry goods, A small hotel that doubled as the only saloon worth calling one, a land office at the far end, and a building near the middle that had a painted board above the door reading Alcott, Legal Matters. Clara had never had reason to go in. She went in. Alcott himself was a small man, narrow through the shoulders, with spectacles that sat crooked and didn't seem to bother him. He looked up from his desk when she came in and waited for her to say what she needed. She told him. All of it, as concisely as she could manage. The deed, the filing, the improvements, Victor's visit, the document he'd carried that wasn't a court order. Alcott listened with his hands flat on the desk. When she finished, he said, "How long ago did your husband file the original claim?" 7 years? And you've been in continuous residence for all 7 years? 8, counting the year before he filed. We were there on the land while the paperwork was processing. Alcott wrote something on a small pad. The document Hale showed you. Did you read it? He didn't offer it to me. He held it up for the street. Something passed across Alcott's face, not quite a smile. That tells you something about what it actually says. He set down his pen. Mrs. Whitmore, a contested inheritance claim on a homestead with continuous residence and documented improvements is not a simple case for either side. Hale has some legal standing to argue, depending on how the original deed was written and what the land office has on record. But you have standing too, possibly more given the duration of your residency. Can I win? He looked at her steadily. That depends on several things. Tell me the things. First, the deed needs to clearly establish that the claim passes to surviving family, including a wife, not just to male heirs. If Thomas was specific in his filing, you're on stronger ground. Second, the land office examiner who handles the hearing will matter considerably. Some are fair, some have already decided before you walk in. Third, he paused. This is the difficult one. A woman holding a frontier claim alone, without male partnership on record, can face resistance that has nothing to do with the law and everything to do with how the examiner interprets frontier necessity. Victor Hale will almost certainly argue that you cannot viably maintain the property without a husband. Clara was quiet for a moment. You're saying my gender is the argument. I'm saying Victor Hale is going to use it as one. Whether it works depends on who's listening. She sat back. What would change that? Alcott said nothing. He looked at her over his spectacles. A husband on the deed, she said. He neither confirmed nor denied. He just looked at her. Clara stood up. What do I owe you for this? Come back when the hearing is scheduled, he said. We'll talk about fees then. Right now, all I've done is talk. She walked back out into the afternoon and stood in the street for a moment with the sun cutting sideways across the false fronts of the buildings. A man she didn't recognize was unloading lumber from a wagon 2 doors down. A woman with a baby on her hip came out of the dry goods and hurried past without looking at her. Clara started walking home. She was halfway through the edge of town where the buildings thinned out and the road turned to packed dirt between grass when she heard the wagon. She moved to the side without thinking. Habit. And the wagon slowed as it came alongside her. She looked up. The man on the bench was maybe 40 or somewhere around there. It was hard to say exactly. He had the kind of face that outdoor work made ageless in certain ways and weathered in others. Leather dark, with creases at the eyes from years of squinting into distance. He had his hat pushed back slightly, and he was looking at her the way someone looks when they recognize a person but aren't sure if they should say so. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Not a question. She stopped walking. Do I know you? Ethan Cole. He said it plainly, like a fact being established rather than an introduction being made. I work the Garfield spread north side. I was in town when Hale came this morning. She looked at him. Were you? I wasn't close enough to hear all of it, he said. But I heard enough. He didn't look away from her, but he also didn't push at the silence. He just let it be there. Is there something you want, Mr. Cole? He seemed to think about how to answer that. Not evasive, more like someone who didn't want to say the wrong thing and was choosing carefully. I've got a load of split wood in this wagon that I was going to take back to the spread, but the Garfield place doesn't need it as much as it looks like your fence line might. I could drop it on my way through. Clara stared at him. That's... She stopped. That's a strange offer from someone I've never met. I know it. What do you want in return? He shook his head once. Nothing. She didn't believe that, not because she thought he was lying exactly, but because nothing was never nothing, and she'd learned that thoroughly enough that she couldn't unknow it. But she also looked at his face, and she looked at the wood in the wagon, and she thought about the northern fence, which was held together in two places by prayer and habit. Fine, she said. She climbed up on the bench beside him without waiting to be helped. They rode in silence for a while. The wagon creaked. The horse, a bay with a steady gait, moved without complaint. Clara watched the road and thought about Alcott's office and what he hadn't quite said. After a while, Ethan said, I heard he's already been to the land office. That's what he told me. Dobbs is the examiner up there now. New man. Came in from the east 6 months ago. He paused. He's not corrupt, but he's cautious, likes clear-cut cases. And mine isn't one. Not the way Hale's going to present it. Clara looked at him. You seem to know a lot about the land office for a ranch hand. I had a claim contested 2 years back. Different situation, similar machinery. He kept his eyes on the road. Lost it. Something in his voice when he said that. Not bitterness, which she'd expected, but something quieter, like he'd made a kind of peace with it that cost him more than the making. I'm sorry, she said. Not your fault. He said it easily, not brushing her off, just stating it. But I learned how those hearings work, what carries weight and what doesn't. She turned back to watching the road. The homestead was coming into view ahead. The roof of the house, the barn, the fence line going ragged along the northern edge. From this distance, it looked like what it was, a hard-won piece of ground that a family had dug into and built on and tried to make mean something. She said, The lawyer told me that Victor's going to argue a woman alone can't maintain a frontier claim. Ethan didn't respond right away. He's not wrong, Clara said, that it's harder. I know it's harder, but harder isn't the same as impossible, and I've been doing it for 4 months. 4 months is one thing, Ethan said. A hearing is another. What they're going to look for is whether you can demonstrate sustainable operation of the claim. Numbers, not effort. I have a ledger. That helps. They reached the edge of the property, and he pulled the wagon up near the north fence. He climbed down, and she climbed down, and he started pulling wood from the wagon bed without ceremony. She grabbed the other end of a split log. They worked in silence for a stretch, stacking, sorting, him taking the heavier ends without making a thing of it. The afternoon was going long and golden, the light doing what it did out here, making the scrubby land look like something a painter might want to lie about. After a while, Ethan said, without looking at her, Would a husband on paper keep him off your land? Clara's hands went still. She looked at him. He was still stacking, hadn't stopped, like he'd said something practical instead of something that cracked a door she hadn't even known was there. Say that again, she said. He set down the log in his hands. He straightened up, and he looked at her, and he said it clearly. A legal marriage filed and recorded. It wouldn't have to be anything other than what it was. But it would change what the examiner sees when he looks at the claim. It would change what Victor can argue. Clara said nothing. The wind came through and moved the grass along the fence, and she stood in it and felt her mind doing what it did when it was sorting something too complicated to sort in a straight line. You're serious, she said. I am. You'd marry a woman you don't know to keep a man you've never met off her property. He looked at her steadily. I know what losing land is like. I know what it does to people. He picked up another log. And I know that what Hale's doing isn't about inheritance law. It's about a man who thinks things belong to him because nobody's going to stand in the way. I'd like to stand in the way. Clara crossed her arms. She was aware, distantly, that the rational thing was to say no, to thank him and refuse and figure out another path. She was also aware that she could not currently see another path. What do you want from it? She asked. The real answer. He thought about it, which she appreciated. She'd have trusted him less if he'd answered immediately. Nothing from you, he said. And I'd want that in writing. The land stays yours and your children's. I don't make claims on property. I don't run the household. I'm just a name on a piece of paper that makes it harder for Victor Hale to stand in front of an examiner and say you can't do this alone. You'd work the place? I already work. One place or another doesn't change much. Clara stared at him for a long time. He let her stare. He didn't fill the space with more words. I'm not looking for a husband, she said. I know that. Thomas has been dead 4 months. I know that too. And I don't know you. No, he said. You don't. She uncrossed her arms. She looked at the fence, at the 2 places where it was held by hope rather than hardware, at the long line of it going north across land she had watched her husband build and had continued building after him. Come to dinner, she said. He blinked. That surprised him, which meant she'd seen his face be still through everything else, and this was the thing that moved it. She filed that away. Just dinner, she said, and we'll talk about what an agreement like this would actually look like. All right, he said. Luke will be there. And Annie. All right. She picked up a split log. Finish stacking this first. He picked up a log too. They worked until the light went flat and the wagon was empty, and then they walked to the house without speaking, and Clara's mind was going in about 11 directions at once, and underneath all of it was something she couldn't quite name. Something that was not hope exactly, or not only hope, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt dangerously like the possibility that she was not entirely alone in this fight. She reminded herself that she barely knew this man. She reminded herself that trust was a thing you built and not a thing you found already assembled. She pushed open the door to the kitchen and called for Luke. Victor Hale had 30 days on his side. She was starting to think she might have something better. Dinner at the Whitmore table was not a comfortable thing. Claire had known it wouldn't be, but she'd underestimated exactly which kind of uncomfortable it would turn out to be. She'd expected the children to be quiet and watchful. She'd expected Ethan Cole to sit stiffly and say too little or too much. What she hadn't expected was for Luke to open with the question before the food was even on the table. Why are you here? He said it to Ethan directly, standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed in a posture that was so precisely Thomas's that Clara had to look away for a second. Ethan was sitting at the far end of the table, hat on his knee, hands folded. He looked at Luke without flinching and said, Your mother invited me. I know that. I'm asking why you came when she did. Luke? Clara's voice was quiet, but it landed. It's a fair question, Ethan said. He wasn't bothered, or at least he didn't show it. He looked at the boy steadily. I brought wood for your fence this afternoon. Your mother and I have something we need to talk through. That's all the answer I have right now. Luke stared at him for a long moment with the precise, unblinking assessment that children used before they learned to be polite about suspicion. Then he pulled out his chair and sat down. Annie had been watching all of this from the corner of the kitchen where she'd stationed herself near the stove, ostensibly helping Clara, but actually watching Ethan the way a cat watches something new that has entered the house. Not hostile, just measuring. She was 9 and small for her age, and had her father's coloring, dark hair, and gray eyes, and she had a habit of going very still and very quiet when she was thinking hard, which she was doing now. Clara set the pot on the table. Salt pork and beans, a pan of cornbread, a jar of the pickled carrots she'd put up in the fall. Nothing she was proud of, nothing she was ashamed of either. It was what she had. Annie, she said, sit down. Annie sat. She looked at Ethan. Do you have a horse? I do. What's his name? Dunn. She considered this. That's not a name. That's a color. Something moved at the corner of Ethan's mouth. Not quite a smile. You're right. He came with it. I didn't see a reason to change what he already answered to. Annie seemed to find this acceptable. She reached for the cornbread. Clara sat. She looked at Ethan across the table, and he looked back at her, and there was a brief, wordless negotiation about whether any of this conversation was going to happen in front of the children or wait until after, and they settled it without speaking. After. They ate. It was not easy, and not terrible. Luke asked Ethan 2 more questions during the meal. Both practical, both about the Garfield spread, both designed, Claire understood, to measure whether this man knew what he was talking about when it came to land work. Ethan answered both without embellishment and without performing knowledge he didn't have. When Luke asked about the north grazing situation at Garfield, Ethan said he didn't know the full picture because he only worked the south fence line, and Luke nodded like that was the right answer. After, Clara sent both children to bed with a firmness that didn't allow for argument, and she and Ethan sat at the cleared table with 2 cups of coffee that were more hot water than anything else, and she laid out what Alcott had told her. All of it. The deed language, the examiner, the way a woman's claim read differently to the land office than a couple's claim. She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to say hard things since Thomas died, without softening the edges, because soft edges didn't help you see the shape of the problem. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "Alcott's right about Dobbs. He's not crooked, but he's going to follow the path that looks most settled. A contested claim from a widow, with a male relative pushing on the other side, that's not settled. That's a problem he has to solve, and men like Dobbs solve problems by finding the easiest answer. And the easiest answer is to let Victor have it. Not necessarily, but it's the answer that requires the least argument." He turned his cup on the table. "If there's a husband on the deed, the argument changes. Hale's still going to push, but what he's pushing against is different." Clara looked at him. "I need to understand what you get from this. I told you. You told me nothing from me and the land stays mine. I heard that, but you're a man working a spread that isn't yours, and you're offering to legally attach your name to someone else's problem. There's something you want, or something you're running from, or something you believe that I'm not seeing yet, and I need to know what it is before I consider this any further." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his cup. "2 years ago I had a claim north of here," he said. "Small, about 160 acres, creek running through the east side. Nothing much to look at, but it was mine. Filed legal, worked it for 3 years. He stopped. "A man named Proctor moved into the territory and started buying up everything adjacent. Offered me a price that was about 1/3 of what the land was worth. I said no. He went to the land office with a prior survey claim. Turned out to be fabricated. We found that out later, much later. And by the time the hearing happened, I didn't have the documentation I needed to fight it clean." "What happened to Proctor?" "Nothing. That's how that story ends." He said it without anger, which was the part that made it land heavier. "He's got the land. He's probably got 4 more claims by now, and I'm working Garfield's south fence line for wages." He looked at his hands. "I know what that machinery feels like from the inside. I know what it does to a person when the ground they built something on gets taken because they didn't have the right words on the right piece of paper at the right time." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the lie in it, because the lie was usually there if you looked. She didn't find one. That didn't mean it wasn't there. "If I agree to this," she said, "and I'm not saying I am, I need certain things in writing before any of this goes to the county clerk." "All right. The land is mine and my children's. Full stop. No claim from you. Not during. Not after. Not ever. Agreed. You work the place. You're compensated from the operation like any hired hand. You don't take on debt in the homestead's name. You don't make agreements with buyers or sellers on the property's behalf. Agreed. And if this works, if the hearing goes the way we need it to, you're free to go when you want. No obligation past what this was." He nodded. "Same to you." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "Means if you need out of it for any reason, you say so and we figure out how to dissolve it legally. I'm not looking to trap anyone." Clara picked up her cup. The coffee was cold now. She drank it anyway. "I'll talk to Alcott tomorrow," she said. "If he says the arrangement can be drawn up properly, I'll consider it. And you'll sign whatever he puts in front of you about the property before anything else gets signed." "That's fair?" "It's not about fair," she said. "It's about protecting my children." He looked at her steadily. "I know the difference," he said. She believed him. She wasn't sure if that was wisdom or desperation, and she was too tired to work out which. Alcott took 40 minutes and 2 cups of his own coffee to think through the arrangement before he said anything useful. Clara sat across from him and waited. Ethan sat beside her and did the same. Finally, Alcott set down his pen and said, "It's not the strangest arrangement I've drawn up. It's close." He looked between them. "But it's legal. A property agreement attached to a marriage filing is not unheard of, particularly in territorial homestead situations. I can draft something that establishes the ownership structure clearly and attach it to the marriage record. The important thing is that the land office sees it as a legitimate filing, not a paper marriage." "How do we make sure they see it that way?" Clara asked. "Legitimacy in these situations comes from 2 things. the paperwork being correct, and the domestic situation being credible. He looked at Ethan. You'll need to be resident on the property, not visiting, resident, working, eating, present. Ethan said, That's fine. There'll be questions, Alcott said, from the examiner, probably from Hale's side too. They'll want to know when you met, how the arrangement came about, what your intentions are. The truth about how we met is recent, Clara said. I can't claim a long history. Then you don't claim it. You claim what's real, that you formed an arrangement that is both practical and genuine, that you've been working the property together, and that you intend to continue doing so. Alcott looked at her over his spectacles. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm telling you which truths to lead with. Clara nodded once. I'll have the documents ready in 3 days, Alcott said. That gives you time to get the witnesses you'll need and file before the month is out. Outside on the street, Clara walked 2 steps and stopped. She didn't know quite what she expected to feel, and she wasn't feeling it. She was feeling something more like the sensation of having committed to a direction without knowing if it was the right direction, which was not exactly a new experience, but was not a comfortable one either. Ethan stopped beside her. You can still say no, he said. I know that. If it doesn't sit right, I said I know. She said it without heat. She started walking. 3 days. Make sure you're where I can find you. He said he would be. None. Those 3 days were their own particular kind of strange. Ethan moved his things from the bunkhouse at Garfield, which was, she learned, not much. A bedroll, a canvas bag, a rifle, a small tin of tools, and put them in the barn loft, which was where she'd told him he could stay. He hadn't argued about it. He hadn't looked around the barn like he was measuring it against something better. He'd climbed the ladder, put his things up, and come back down and asked what needed doing. There was always something that needed doing. He fixed the east water trough the morning after he arrived, pulled the bad plank, replaced it with lumber from the wagon wood, caulked it with what he had it holding water by noon. Clara watched from the kitchen window and told herself she was watching to see if he knew what he was doing, which was true, but was not the entire truth. Luke watched too, less secretly. By the second afternoon, Luke was in the yard with him while Ethan repaired a gap in the south fence, not helping exactly but standing close enough that he could see. Ethan didn't chase him off or make a show of including him. He just worked, and eventually Luke picked up a post and held it while Ethan drove the staple, and that was all either of them said about it. Annie asked Ethan at breakfast on the second morning if Dunn had any other names. Not that he's told me, Ethan said. Maybe he's waiting to see if you deserve to know, Annie said, very seriously. Ethan considered this. That's possible. Clara watched her daughter accept this answer and return to her porridge, and felt something she had no name for shift quietly inside her chest. The marriage was filed on a Wednesday morning. Alcott was the witness, along with old Harmon from the feed store, who asked no questions and seemed to consider it none of his business, which Clara appreciated more than she could say. The property agreement was attached. Everything was signed. It took less time than she expected and felt more serious than she was prepared for, which was its own surprise. They walked out into the late morning, and Ethan said, You all right? Ask me in 30 days, she said. He didn't push it. Bopershen. Victor Hale found out by Friday. Clara didn't know exactly how. This was a small town, and small towns had their own information systems that operated faster than anything official, but she knew he'd found out because his man, the one with the leather vest, rode past the homestead twice on Friday afternoon at a walking pace, looking at the property the way men looked at things they were being paid to look at. She noted it. She didn't go outside. Saturday morning, Victor himself came. He didn't bring the men this time. He came alone, which was different enough from the first visit that Clara recognized it as its own kind of message, that he was adjusting, recalculating, trying a different approach. She was in the garden when he rode up, and she stayed where she was, still kneeling in the dirt, and made him come to her instead of the other way around. He stopped his horse at the garden edge. She looked up at him. Heard you got married, he said. That's not news you needed to ride out here to confirm. Funny timing. Is it? She went back to working the soil, Her hands were dirty, and she was aware of it and didn't care. Clara, his voice shifted. Not softer. Victor Hale didn't do soft. But something in it changed angle, like he was trying a different tool. Thomas would have wanted this settled between family, not in a courthouse. Thomas wanted me and his children to keep this land, she said, without looking up. He was very clear about that. Thomas is gone. I'm aware. That man you married, you know anything about him? Where he came from? Whether he has debts, obligations, legal problems that could follow him onto this property? Clara stood up. She brushed the dirt from her hands onto her apron and looked at Victor directly. I know enough. You know enough. He repeated it like the words tasted wrong. Clara, this isn't about the land. Every single thing you've done since Thomas's funeral has been about the land, she said. Don't insult either of us by pretending it isn't. He stared at her. His jaw worked once. The hearing's still scheduled. Whatever you file this week won't change what I've already put in motion. Then you'd better be sure your paperwork is in order, she said, because mine is. She went back to the garden. She didn't watch him leave, but she heard his horse move and she heard the sound get smaller, and then she sat back on her heels and let out a long, slow breath into the dirt. Her hands were shaking a little. They did that sometimes when the adrenaline had nowhere else to go. She pressed them flat against the ground until they stopped. What's up? Ethan had been in the barn when Victor arrived and had stayed there. She'd told him the previous night that if Victor came back, she would handle it, and he'd said all right without argument. When she came in for the noon meal, she told him what had been said. He was quiet through most of it. Then he said, he asked about my debts. He was fishing. He's going to dig. Ethan said it without particular alarm, which meant he'd already thought about it. What he finds is that I lost a claim 2 years back. He might try to use that. Make it look like I married you for access to land since I don't have my own. Clara hadn't thought of that angle. She thought of it now. Would that hold up? Depends on how it's presented. Dobbs doesn't know me. Hale's going to be in that examiner's ear before the hearing telling him whatever story makes me look like an opportunist. Then we need to be ready to tell a different story. We need more than a story, Ethan said. We need the work. She looked at him. 6 weeks until the hearing, he said. 6 weeks of documented work on this property. Fence repairs, water management, any structural improvements we can manage. Everything written down, dated, witnessed where we can get witnesses. He paused. And the ledger. You said Thomas kept one? I've kept it since February. Can I look at it? She got up, went to the bedroom, lifted the corner of the floorboard, and brought out the tin box. She set it on the table and opened it and pulled out Thomas's ledger, and then her own. Thinner, 4 months' worth, the writing cramped because she'd been trying to use the pages carefully. She set both in front of him. He looked at them for a long time. She watched him read, or not read exactly, more like absorb, moving through the columns and entries the way someone moved through familiar terrain. His finger tracked down a page and stopped. What's this? North line, third post, compromised. The fence post has been leaning since March. I don't have the right lumber yet. What size? 4 by 4, 8 feet. He nodded, still looking at the ledger. There's a sawmill 12 miles east. I can get the lumber on credit from Garfield. They owe me 2 weeks' wages. I'll take it in materials instead. Clara looked at him. You'd spend your back wages on my fence posts. He looked up. Our fence posts. She didn't say anything to that. He went back to the ledger. She watched him work through it, and she was trying to figure out what to make of this man. This particular man who had walked into her life 4 days ago with a wagon of split wood and an offer that made no sense on the surface and too much sense underneath. She was not a woman given to easy trust. Thomas had known that about her and had never tried to change it, had said once that her skepticism was the most honest thing about her. But there was something about the way Ethan Cole sat at her table with her husband's ledger, and her ledger that she could not quite categorize as a threat. It was something else, something she wasn't ready to name and wasn't trying to. The well, she said. Thomas dug it in the second year. That's a significant improvement. The land value is higher with a reliable water source. Alcott should know to put that in front of the examiner. Good. He turned a page. You've got 5 years of crop records here. Is that all of them, or did some get lost? Thomas lost the first year's records in a fire. The barn caught. An accident. We rebuilt it the following spring. The rebuild is documented? In the first ledger, yes. He nodded. Hale's going to try to find gaps. Any gap in the record is a place he can push. There are gaps, she said. There are always gaps. Then we need answers for the gaps. Not excuses, answers. Things like, the records for that period were lost in the barn fire of such and such year. The reconstruction is documented here. Clara was quiet for a moment. You know a lot about how these hearings work. I told you, I went through one. And lost. He met her eyes. Because I wasn't prepared the way I needed to be. I'm trying to make sure that doesn't happen again. She noticed he said again. Not to you. Again. Like this hearing was also somehow his. Not because he had a claim, but because losing was something he was done with. She didn't comment on it. She reached across the table and turned the ledger to the page she wanted. This is the record of the well dig. Here's the water table depth. Here's the date. Here's the name of the man Thomas hired to help with the casing. Ethan looked at it. Is that man still in the territory? I don't know. Worth finding out. A witness who remembers the work is worth more than a written record alone, in a hearing room. Clara wrote herself a note on the edge of a scrap of paper. She was already making a list in her head. The well witness, the lumber for the fence, the continued entries in the ledger, Alcott's preparation. The hearing was 6 weeks out. 6 weeks was not long, but it was something. Luke appeared in the doorway that evening while Clara and Ethan were still at the table, working through the second ledger. He stopped when he saw them. Not alarmed, more like he was recalculating something. What are you doing? He asked. Getting ready for the land office hearing, Clara said. Luke came into the kitchen. He pulled out his chair and sat down and looked at the ledgers and then at Ethan. Can I help? It was the first time he'd asked Ethan anything that wasn't designed to test him. Clara kept her eyes on the ledger. Ethan said, You know the property lines? Better than anyone. I used to walk them with my father. Can you draw them? Accurate as you remember? Luke was already reaching for the scrap paper. I'll need a pencil. Ethan produced one from his shirt pocket without comment and slid it across the table. Clara watched her son bend over the paper and start drawing from memory. The north line, the creek edge, the fence corners, the barn placement, with a precision that surprised even her. Thomas had taught him. She hadn't realized how thoroughly. The kitchen was quiet except for the pencil and the sound of the wind outside, and the lamp made a small, warm circle over the three of them at the table. And outside the night was large and cold, and Victor Hale was somewhere in it making plans. And Clara Whitmore was making different ones. She turned to the next page of the ledger, and she kept working. The lumber came on a Tuesday, which was also the day Clara found out Victor Hale had been talking to her neighbors. Ethan had driven the 12 miles to the sawmill and back in one day, which meant he'd left before sunup and come back with the wagon loaded in the last gray light of the afternoon, the 4x4 posts stacked clean and smelling of fresh-cut pine. Luke was waiting at the fence line when the wagon rolled in, because Luke had been watching the road since noon and hadn't said so, which was the particular way 12-year-old boys pretended they weren't waiting for something. They unloaded together, the three of them, while Annie stood on the bottom fence rail and watched with her arms folded over the top. The posts were heavy, and the ground was still half frozen under the top layer of mud, and nobody talked much because the work didn't require it. It was after, when they were walking back to the house and the light was nearly gone, that Ethan said, I stopped at the Delacroix place on the way back to see if they knew where I could find the man who helped Thomas dig the well. Clara looked at him. And? Margaret Delacroix wouldn't come out of the house. He said it carefully, like he was still working out what it meant. Her husband came to the door and was polite enough, but short. Told me they didn't want to get involved in any land disputes. Clara stopped walking. He used that phrase specifically, land disputes. He did. She turned to look at the dark road running past her property toward town. Victor's been talking to people. Looks that way. Ethan's voice stayed level, telling them that anyone who sides with you is siding against him. He's got money and he's been here longer than we have. People remember that. He's been here the same number of years as Thomas, Clara said, and her voice had an edge in it she didn't try to hide. Thomas built this. Victor bought influence in town and called it the same thing. Ethan let her say it. He didn't try to add to it or diminish it. That was one of the things she'd noticed about him in these 2 weeks. He understood when something was being said that needed only to be heard, not responded to. They went inside. She fed the children and got Annie to bed and sat at the table while Luke did his reading by the lamp, and she thought about the Delacroix family. Margaret had stood at the dry goods with her package under her arm the morning Victor came and hadn't moved, the same as everyone else. She'd watched, but watching didn't mean willing to stand up and say what you saw, and Clara understood that too, even if it sat in her chest like something with corners. The next morning, she went to 3 other neighbors herself, alone. Without telling Ethan where she was going, not because she was keeping it from him, but because some conversations needed to be had by the person they were about. She went to the Pruitt family first, a quarter-mile north. Old Emmett Pruitt came out to the porch and had the decency to look uncomfortable rather than pretending he didn't know what she was there about. "Clara," he said. "Emmett." She stood in his yard, direct. "I need to know if you'll speak to what you've seen on this property over the years. The work Thomas did. The work I've done since." Emmett was quiet for a moment. His wife was visible in the window, watching. "Victor Hale was here 2 days ago," he said finally. "I know he was somewhere. What did he offer you?" He looked startled that she'd said it that flat. "He didn't offer—" "Emmett," she held his gaze. "He either offered you something or threatened you with something. I'm not going to pretend the man works another way." Emmett looked at his boots. He was 60 years old and had lived out here his whole life, and had the rounded shoulders of a man who'd decided long ago that conflict was a thing to walk around. "He said there might be questions about the survey line between your north property and mine," he said, quietly. He mentioned a possible overlap that hadn't been formally resolved. "There's no overlap," Clara said. "Thomas had it surveyed in the 3rd year. The record's at the land office." "I know that. I know it, Clara." He looked up. "But having someone make noise about it is expensive even when you win." She looked at him for a long moment. She wasn't angry at Emmett Pruitt, or not only angry, she was angry at the system that made it rational for a decent man to step back from what he knew was right, because the cost of being right was something he couldn't afford. That was the real machinery Victor was operating. Not the law exactly, but the fear of the law's expense. "All right," she said. "I understand." She went to the next 2 properties and got variations on the same answer. By the time she walked home, the sun was high, and her feet hurt, and she had a very clear picture of what Victor had done in the 10 days since he'd found out about her marriage. He'd insulated himself. Built a wall of nervous neighbors between himself and any coalition she might try to form. People who wouldn't testify against her, but also wouldn't testify for her, which amounted to the same thing. She told Ethan that night. He sat with it for a minute. "Alcott," he said. "What about him? He knows what was filed, what was recorded, what's in the land office record. He doesn't need neighbors to be brave. He needs documentation to be clean." Ethan looked at her across the table. "Victor can scare people. He can't scare paper." "The well witness," Clara said. "I still need a human voice who remembers the work." "I've been thinking about that." He turned his cup. "The man Thomas hired, his name in the ledger is R. Sutter. I asked around at the sawmill yesterday. There's a Sutter family in Callow Creek, about 8 miles south. Different county. Different county means Victor's reach might not extend there." "Might not," Ethan said. "I'd like to ride out there this week if you can manage without me for a day." "I've been managing without help for 4 months," she said. "One day is fine." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she couldn't fully read, Massan. Not offense, not quite. Something more like the feeling of a remark landing differently than it was aimed. She hadn't meant it as a cut, or she'd meant it partly and not entirely, which was its own kind of thing. "That came out sideways," she said. "It's all right. It wasn't directed at you." "I know." He picked up his cup. "I'll ride out Thursday." She nodded. She was tired, the kind of tired that lived behind the eyes and didn't fully clear with sleep. And she was also sitting here in her kitchen at 9 at night making plans with a man she'd known less than 3 weeks. And sometimes the strangeness of it rose up, and she had to remind herself that strange was not the same as wrong. He came back from Callow Creek on Thursday evening with Roy Sutter, or rather, with Roy Sutter's son Daniel, because Roy Sutter had died the previous winter of a lung complaint. Daniel was around 30, heavy-set, with his father's work-roughened hands and a directness about him that Clara liked immediately. He came in and sat at the table and drank coffee and said, "My father talked about that well. Talked about it more than once, actually. Said it was one of the cleanest digs he'd been a part of. Good water table, solid casing. Your husband knew what he was doing with the placement." "Would you say that under oath?" Clara asked. Daniel Sutter looked at her steadily. "My father was proud of that work. I don't see a reason to let someone take credit from him by staying quiet." He paused. "I'll say what I know." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Not much, just enough. After Sutter left with directions to Alcott's office and the date of the hearing written on a folded paper, she sat at the table and realized her hands were in her lap, and she was just sitting. Not moving, not calculating, just sitting. Ethan was across from her doing the same. "One witness," she said. "It's more than we had yesterday." "Victor has lawyers. We have Alcott and a man who knew someone who dug a well." "And the ledgers," Ethan said, "and Luke's property map, and 8 years of documented improvements." He paused. "And the fact that the truth of who's been working this land is not actually in dispute. Victor knows it, the neighbors know it, Dobbs will know it the minute he looks at the records. What Hale's banking on is that the law has enough gaps that it doesn't matter what's true." Clara looked at him. "Does it? Have enough gaps?" "Sometimes," he said. "Not always." She exhaled. "That is the least comforting thing anyone has said to me in recent memory." "I know, but I'm not going to tell you it's certain when it isn't." She appreciated that. She would rather have the honest, uncomfortable answer than the comfortable, false one, always. Thomas had known that about her, too. "The hearing is 4 weeks out," she said. 4 weeks. A lot can still go wrong." "A lot," he agreed. "You're terrible at reassurance," she said. Something shifted in his face, that almost smile again, the one that lived at the corner of his mouth and never quite completed itself. "I've been told." She looked at him, and for a moment she didn't look away when she should have, and neither did he. Then she got up and started putting away the cups, and he got up and helped her, and neither of them said anything about the moment because there was nothing to say yet and possibly wouldn't be. It was Annie who noticed first. Not the legal situation, not the hearing, not Victor's maneuvering. Annie noticed the thing nobody was talking about, which was what Annie did. She moved through the house quietly, and she absorbed things that adults thought they were keeping to themselves. She came to Clara one morning while Ethan was at the fence with Luke and said, without preamble, "Is Ethan going to stay after the hearing?" Clara was making bread. She kept her hands in the dough. "I don't know yet, sweetheart." "Do you want him to?" The question was delivered with the absolute guilelessness of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned that some questions weren't supposed to be asked. And Clara had to stop kneading for a moment because the answer that came up first was not as simple as she wanted it to be. "That depends on a lot of things," she said carefully. Annie leaned against the table and looked at her. "He fixed the water trough," she said, "and he doesn't talk too much. And he lets Luke do things instead of telling him to go away." "Those are good qualities," Clara said. "Papa talked too much sometimes," Annie said, with the frank honesty of a child who loved her father absolutely and also remembered him accurately. "But it was funny when he did." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to forget what Papa sounded like." Clara stopped. She turned from the table and crouched down to Annie's level, flour on her hands and probably on her face, and she looked at her daughter. "You're not going to forget," she said. "I promise you that." Annie looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because I'm going to remember for both of us until you can hold it yourself." Clara touched her daughter's face. "That's what I'm here for." Annie leaned against her for a moment, not a long time, just enough, and then she straightened and said, "Can I have a piece of bread when it's done?" "When it cools? That's too long." "That's how bread works," Clara said, and went back to the dough. She thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. She thought about what Annie had not said, which was that she'd noticed Ethan in the first place, had cataloged his qualities, had formed an opinion about them. Children didn't do that about people they expected to disappear. That evening, Ethan came in from the fence work and washed his hands at the pump, and came to the table, and Annie set his cup at his place the same as she set everyone else's, without being asked and without making a ceremony of it. Ethan didn't comment on it. Clara watched him notice and say nothing, and she thought that was exactly the right response, and she didn't examine too closely why she thought that. Whoops. 3 weeks before the hearing, Victor made his next move. It came through the land office, an official notice properly filed, naming Ethan Cole specifically and questioning whether his residency on the property was genuine or a recent arrangement designed to manufacture standing. The notice included, attached, a statement from a man named Greer who worked at the Garfield spread and was willing to testify that Ethan had been a bunkhouse resident until approximately 3 weeks prior to the marriage filing. Clara read the notice standing in Alcott's doorway because she couldn't make herself go the rest of the way into the office. Alcott said, "This is not unexpected. He's saying the marriage is a fraud. He's saying it's convenient. That's different. He doesn't have proof of fraud. He has proof of timing, which is not the same thing. Convenient arrangements are not illegal." Alcott took the notice back. "But it's a problem, because Dobbs is going to look at this and see a question mark, and we need to answer the question mark better than Hale has raised it." "How?" "We establish residency comprehensively. Every day Ethan Cole has been on that property needs to be documented. Witnesses who saw him there, dates, what work was being done. We build a picture that's bigger than Greer's statement. The neighbors won't help us. Not all of them." Alcott looked at her. "But there are people who've come to the property for reasons of business. The sawmill delivered lumber. That's a delivery record with a date. Anyone who's seen him there in the course of ordinary commerce doesn't have to be brave. They just have to say what they observed." Clara thought. "The Sutter boy came to the property. Good. The feed store, Harmon. He witnessed the marriage filing. He's seen Ethan in town with me since. Harmon is useful. Get me names and I'll get statements." She walked back to the homestead and told Ethan that evening. His face stayed controlled through most of it, but she caught the moment his jaw tightened when she mentioned Greer's name. "Greer," he said. "You know him. We've worked the same spread for 8 months. He was quiet for a second. "He's not lying. I was in the bunkhouse, but the framing is Victor's," Clara said. "That's what he does. He takes true things and builds false pictures out of them." Ethan looked at her. "Are you all right?" She'd been expecting him to react to the legal threat, not to ask about her. She opened her mouth and closed it. "I'm angry," she said. "Yeah. I'm very angry, and I'm also scared, and I'm tired of those two things living together in the same body." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "The anger's useful. The fear keeps you careful. You want to keep both." "That sounds like something someone told you." "My mother," he said. He said it simply, not with any particular weight on it, and went back to looking at the notice in his hands. It was the first time he'd mentioned anyone from before his own failed claim. It was such a small thing, and Clara noticed it with the part of her that noticed small things, cataloged them, and tried to figure out what they added up to. She took the notice back. She put it in the tin box next to Thomas's ledger and her own and the property agreement she'd signed with Ethan 3 weeks ago and the marriage filing. The box was getting heavier. She put the floorboard back. 2 weeks before the hearing, something happened that Clara had not calculated for. She'd been so focused on Victor, on Alcott, on the documentation and the witnesses and the examiner that she hadn't been watching the thing that was happening at her own kitchen table every single night. It crept up on her the way things did when you were paying attention to everything else. Not all at once, but in the accumulation of small moments that you didn't file anywhere because they didn't seem to belong in any category you already had. The moment she actually noticed was ordinary to the point of being almost boring. She'd come in from the garden at dusk to find Luke and Ethan at the table, not working on the ledger or the property map or anything to do with the hearing. Luke had a piece of paper in front of him with something drawn on it, and Ethan was looking at it and they were having an argument. A genuine, low-voiced, disagreement-type argument. The kind where both people think they're right and neither is backing down. "The creek bends east by at least 30 feet before it hits the property line," Luke said. "I've walked it. The ledger has it bending west. The ledger is wrong. Papa marked it wrong. I think he was measuring from the old marker, not the current bank. The creek moved." Ethan looked at him. "Creeks don't just move." "This one did." There was flooding 3 springs ago. It cut a new path. Luke put his finger on the paper. Look. Here's where it was. Here's where it is now. Ethan studied the drawing. He was quiet for a long moment. If you're right, that changes where the eastern boundary actually sits. I know. Does it benefit us or hurt us? It benefits us, Luke said. The eastern boundary moves out about 40 feet. More land, not less. Ethan looked at the drawing again. Then he looked at Luke. We need to verify that before we take it to Alcott. I don't want to claim something in the hearing that falls apart when someone actually goes and measures. I can show you where the old marker is. We can measure from there. All right, Saturday. All right, Luke said, and went back to the drawing, and Ethan went back to the ledger, and neither of them acknowledged that they'd just agreed to something together without checking with Clara first. Clara stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. She was looking at her son, the set of his shoulders, the way he'd made an argument and held it and been taken seriously, and the way that had straightened something in him she hadn't seen bent until she saw it unbent. She went to the stove and started supper, and didn't say a word about what she'd seen because some things were better observed than commented on. Saturday morning, Ethan and Luke rode out to the eastern boundary with measuring rope and came back 4 hours later with numbers that matched what Luke had drawn. The creek had moved. The boundary moved with it. Alcott needed to know. Clara took Luke to Alcott's office herself on Monday. Let him present his finding. Watched Alcott look at the boy over his spectacles and ask 2 precise questions, and then write something down and say, "Good catch. This goes into the record." Luke was quiet the whole walk home, and then, when they were almost back to the property, he said, "Do you think Alcott thinks I'm too young to be taken seriously?" "He wrote down what you told him," Clara said. "That's what seriously looks like." Luke thought about that. "Ethan said I was right." "You were right." "I know, but he said it first." Clara looked at her son. His face was doing something complicated, pride and something underneath it that she recognized as the particular hunger of a boy who needed, more than most things, for a man to see what he could do. She didn't say anything about that either. 1 week before the hearing, Victor made his final calculated move before they all walked into that room. Clara was alone at the property. Ethan was in town with Alcott, going over the documentation one more time. Luke was at the eastern boundary, checking his measurements against the official survey records Alcott had pulled, and Annie was at the Harmon house in town, where old Harmon's wife had offered to let her help in the shop for the afternoon. Clara was alone in a way she hadn't been in weeks, and she was in the garden pulling the last of the winter root vegetables because the ground was soft enough now, and the work settled her when nothing else did. She heard the wagon before she saw it. 2 wagons, actually. And when she stood up and looked, she saw that one of them had a law office plate on the side. Not Alcott, someone else, someone she didn't know. And the other carried 3 men she also didn't recognize, and Victor Hale was riding behind them on his gray horse. She did not go to the porch this time. She stayed where she was in the garden. Victor dismounted and walked to the garden fence and stood on the other side of it. The other men stayed by the wagons. The one with the law plate got down and opened his satchel and took out a document. "I've petitioned for an emergency injunction," Victor said, "to prevent any further modifications or improvements to the disputed property prior to the hearing." Clara looked at the document without touching it. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that recent modifications to property boundaries, specifically changes to recorded creek boundaries, constitute an attempt to inflate the assessed value of the claim in advance of adjudication." She stared at him. The coldness of it, the specific, precise way he'd targeted Luke's discovery, turned it from a legitimate finding into something that looked like manipulation, hit her somewhere between her stomach and her ribs. "That boundary reflects where the creek actually is," she said. "That'll be for the examiner to determine." He said it pleasantly, like he was discussing something neutral. "In the meantime, the injunction asks the court to freeze any improvements or changes. You can't do any new work on the property. Any new documentation filed after today will be subject to challenge." The lawyer handed the document through the fence. Clara took it this time. She looked at Victor. "You're scared," she said. His expression didn't change. You came here with 2 wagons and a lawyer and 4 men because you're scared the hearing isn't going the way you planned. She held the document at her side. I'll have Alcott respond to this today. It'll hold until the hearing either way. Maybe. She looked at him steadily. But we'll both find out next week, won't we? He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned and went back to his horse. The wagons turned around in the road with the slow, grinding effort that said they'd come a long way to deliver something they thought would be devastating. Clara stood in her garden and watched them go. Then she looked at the injunction in her hand. She read it twice, carefully. She understood most of it, and she didn't understand some of it, and the parts she didn't understand were the parts that scared her, because the law's power was most dangerous in the places you couldn't see clearly. She folded the document. She put it in her apron pocket. She picked up her basket of root vegetables and went inside. She lit the lamp and sat at the table and waited for Ethan to come home, and she used the waiting time to read the injunction again, more carefully, and when she heard the wagon in the yard, she was already at the door. Ethan saw her face before she said anything. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. She held out the document. He took it. He read it standing in the doorway while the last daylight ran out, and she watched his face as he read, and she was learning to read his face a little. Not well, not yet, but enough to see when something landed and how hard. When he looked up, his expression was controlled, and beneath the controlled part there was something she'd only seen in him once before, in the moment he told her about losing his own claim. Not anger. Harder than anger. The look of someone who understood exactly what kind of fight this was and had decided they were still in it. "He knows," Ethan said. "Knows what?" "That the creek boundary helps us, that the documentation we've built is stronger than he expected." He lowered the paper. "This injunction is theater. He's trying to rattle us the week before the hearing." "Is it working?" He looked at her. "Are you rattled?" She thought about it. She thought about the garden and the wagon and Victor's pleasant voice explaining how he'd turned her son's careful work into something that looked like fraud. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Then you'll be careful tomorrow when we take this to Alcott instead of doing something rash tonight." She almost laughed. It came up unexpectedly, the way things sometimes did when the alternative was worse, and she stopped it before it fully arrived, but not before he saw it. "Come inside," she said. "Supper's cold, but it's there." He came inside. Luke came back an hour later, and Victor's men were nowhere visible on the road. And Annie came back from the Harmons with flour on her sleeve and a piece of hard candy that she divided in thirds with scrupulous fairness, giving portions to Clara and Luke, and then stopping in front of Ethan. She held out the last piece. He took it. He said, "Thank you, Annie." She nodded like it was nothing and went to wash her hands. Clara watched from the stove and said nothing and kept her face where it needed to be because the hearing was 6 days away and she needed every part of herself in the right place for it. But she noticed, and she filed it in the place where she was keeping all the things she didn't have words for yet. And she turned back to the stove and fed her family and tried to be ready for what came next. Alcott dismissed the injunction in 40 minutes. Not because it had no teeth, it had some, but because the specific claim Victor had filed that the creek boundary documentation constituted an attempt to inflate property value ahead of adjudication required demonstrating intent, and intent required evidence that wasn't there. Luke had found what he found. He'd told his mother. His mother had told her attorney. The timeline was clean and documented, and Alcott laid it out in front of the county clerk's deputy the following morning with the particular quiet confidence of a man who'd been doing this long enough to know the difference between a legal threat and legal theater. The deputy read the response, read it again, and said he'd have a ruling by end of day. Alcott came out of the clerk's office and said to Clara, "It'll be denied. The mechanism he used requires a stronger showing than he made." "You're sure?" "Reasonably." He adjusted his spectacles. "Which in law means quite." Clara stood on the street outside the clerk's office and let out a breath she'd been holding since the previous afternoon. Ethan was beside her, and he said nothing, which was the right thing. They had 5 days until the hearing. Those 5 days had a particular quality, compressed and too long at the same time, the way time behaved when something large was coming. Clara slept badly and woke early and worked because working was the only thing that kept the anxiety from spreading into the places where the thinking happened. She went over the ledgers again. She went over Thomas's original filing. She sat with Alcott for 2 hours on Thursday while he walked her through what the hearing would look like. The room, the examiner, who would speak and in what order, what Victor's lawyer was likely to argue, and what answers would serve her best. When Dobbs asked you to characterize your operation of the property, Alcott said, don't tell him what you've overcome. Tell him what you've built. What's the difference? Overcoming implies struggle, implies vulnerability. Built implies capacity, implies stability. Dobbs is looking for the answer that requires the least future intervention on his part. Give him a property that runs and a family that runs it. Clara looked at him. And if he asks about Ethan, about why we married when we did? We tell the truth. You met during a period of legal pressure on the property, you formed an arrangement that was both practical and genuine, and you married. Alcott set down his pen. The truth is defensible here. It's the only version of events where every person in that room says the same thing, because it's the only version any of you actually know. She nodded. She thought about that on the walk home. The idea that the truth was strategically useful in this particular situation, which should have been obvious and somehow wasn't, probably because the preceding weeks had involved so much tactical thinking that she'd started to see everything as a move on a board rather than a simple fact to be stated. Friday night, the night before the hearing, nobody slept properly. Clara knew this not because she heard anyone up, but because she heard the quality of the silence in the house change throughout the night. The particular silence of people lying awake trying not to make noise about it. She got up at 4 and built the fire and started coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with Thomas's ledger open in front of her, not reading it, just sitting with it the way you sat with something that had weight you needed to remember. Ethan came down an hour later. He didn't say anything about the hour. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her, and they sat in silence for a while. That wasn't uncomfortable. Eventually he said, "Tell me something about Thomas." Clara looked at him across the table. "Why?" "Because you've been sitting with his ledger for an hour and you haven't turned a page." She looked down at the ledger. She hadn't realized she'd been still that long. "He was a terrible cook," she said, "but genuinely bad. Made coffee that tasted like scorched bark and couldn't understand why anyone would say so." She paused. "He was also the hardest working man I've ever known. Not dramatic about it, just got up and did what needed doing every day without needing to be noticed for it." Ethan said nothing. He drank his coffee. "He would have fought Victor himself," she said. "He'd have been furious. He'd have made it louder than it needed to be and probably done something that didn't help." She almost smiled. "I would have had to manage him." "Sounds like a lot of work." "Marriage is," she said. Then she heard herself. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." She closed the ledger. "Are you ready for today?" He turned his cup. "I know what I'm going to say." "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know that ready is the right word for walking into a room where someone's trying to take something from people who earned it." He looked at her. "But I know why we're going in. That's enough." Luke came down at 5:30 and Annie at 6, and Clara made breakfast and nobody talked about the hearing directly, which was its own kind of talking about it. Annie ate with focused seriousness like she was fueling herself for something. Luke kept going over the property map in his head. Clara could see him doing it, his eyes slightly unfocused, his lips moving barely at all. Ethan ate steadily and didn't perform calm, which was the difference between someone who was actually calm and someone pretending. Clara ate half of what she'd put on her plate and considered that sufficient. The land office hearing room was a plain space. Plank floor, 2 long tables facing a raised desk, 4 windows that let in morning light without warmth. It smelled of paper and wood oil, and the particular institutional dryness of a room used for official things. Examiner Dobbs was already at his desk when they arrived. He was younger than Clara had expected, maybe 45, with a careful, neutral face and the practiced stillness of a man who'd learned to give nothing away before he'd heard everything. He had a ledger of his own open in front of him, and he was reading from it without looking up when they came in. Victor Hale was already seated at the left table with two men, his lawyer, who was the same one who'd appeared at the garden fence, and Greer, the Garfield ranch hand whose statement had been filed in the brief. Victor looked up when Clara entered, and his expression was the same expression it always was, already decided. Clara sat at the right table, Ethan beside her, Alcott on the other side. Daniel Sutter was in the chairs behind the bar, and Harmon and, she turned to Luke, who had insisted on coming and had made the argument clearly enough that she hadn't been able to counter it. Annie was at the Harmon house with Mrs. Harmon. 9 was too young for this particular room. Dobbs looked up when the clock on the wall hit 9. This is the hearing for property claim number 472, the Whitmore homestead, southeast quarter of Section 14. He stated it without inflection. I've read both parties' submissions. We're here to hear testimony and any additional evidence before I issue a determination. Each side will have time to present. I'll ask questions when I have them. I don't want speeches. He looked between the two tables. Mr. Garrison, you represent the petitioner? Victor's lawyer stood. I do. Mr. Alcott, you represent the respondent? Alcott stood. I do. All right, Mr. Garrison, you filed this petition. You go first. Garrison was smooth. Clara had expected smooth, and he delivered it. He laid out Victor's claim with the practiced ease of someone who'd made similar arguments before. The deed language, the question of inheritance rights for a widowed woman under territorial guidelines, the issue of whether a homestead claim could transfer automatically to a surviving spouse absent explicit deed. Language covering that scenario. He was careful not to say anything that was technically false. He just assembled true things in an order that made a picture Clara recognized and hated. When he got to the marriage, he paused for effect. The respondent, Mrs. Clara Whitmore, now Mrs. Cole, entered into a marriage filing approximately 3 weeks after receiving official notice of this petition, he said. The timing raises a reasonable question about the nature of that arrangement. Dobbs said without looking up from his notes. Lots of things raise reasonable questions. What evidence do you have? Garrison produced Greer's statement. Dobbs read it, set it down. This establishes that the husband was previously employed elsewhere. It doesn't establish that the marriage is fraudulent. What else? Garrison pivoted. He was good. He didn't show the hit. He moved to his next argument about the frontier woman's capacity to operate a homestead claim, citing the difficulty of the work, the need for male labor, the practical questions about long-term viability. Clara kept her face still. Dobbs asked, Do you have documentation of the property's current condition, its operation? We have the original claim filing and the original survey. I have those, Dobbs said. They're 8 years old. What's the current condition of the property? Garrison said they didn't have current documentation. Dobbs looked at him. The respondent does? Alcott said from his seat. We do. Dobbs nodded. We'll get there. Garrison finished. He sat down. Victor, beside him, was unreadable, but Clara saw him glance at Dobbs' expression and recalibrate something. Alcott stood. He was not smooth in the way Garrison was smooth. He was precise. He went through the documentation in order. The original filing, Thomas's 8 years of ledger records, the improvements, the barn rebuild after the fire, the well, the fence extensions, the crop records. He laid each item on the record by reference, clearly dated, clearly sourced. Dobbs was taking notes. That was different from how he'd been during Garrison's presentation. The property boundary question, Alcott said. A survey discrepancy was identified recently regarding the Eastern Creek boundary. We have the updated measurements taken by Luke Whitmore, the respondent's son, who has walked those property lines since childhood, and verified against the original survey marker. Garrison said, Objection, that survey modification was the subject of an injunction petition. That was denied, Dobbs said without heat. Yesterday. I have the ruling here. He held up a paper briefly and set it down. Continue. Alcott continued. He presented the updated boundary, noted that it reflected the creek's actual current position after the flooding of 3 springs prior, an event documented in the county water records, which he also submitted, and established that the boundary change represented a gain, not a manipulation. Then he said, I'd like to call Daniel Sutter. Sutter came forward and sat in the chair beside the examiner's desk and told his story plainly. His father had worked the well dig. His father had been proud of the work. He'd described it specifically: the depth, the casing, the water quality, the placement relative to the barn. Daniel Sutter had seen none of it himself, but he'd heard it described enough times that he could answer Dobbs' specific questions accurately, and Dobbs had specific questions. When Garrison cross-examined him, he tried to establish that Daniel's knowledge was secondhand. Daniel agreed that it was. He said his father had told him directly. He said his father did not describe things he hadn't done. Dobbs wrote something down. Then Alcott said, "I'd like to call Ethan Cole." Ethan stood. He moved to the chair beside the examiner's desk and sat without ceremony, hat on his knee, the same posture Clara had first seen at her kitchen table. Dobbs looked at him. "Mr. Cole, how long have you been resident on the Whitmore property?" "Coming on 6 weeks. And before that?" "Working the Garfield spread, south fence line primarily." "Why did you leave?" "The arrangement I had there was finished. The work on the Whitmore property suited me better." Dobbs looked at him steadily. "The petitioner suggests your marriage to Mrs. Whitmore was timed to protect a property claim. How do you respond to that?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Clara had learned that this was not hesitation in him. It was the opposite. It was what happened when he was choosing to be exact. "I'd say the timing's fair to note," he said. "I met Clara during a period when she was under pressure on her property. The pressure existed, the marriage happened. Those two things are both true." He looked at Dobbs. "What's also true is that I've been working that land every day since. The fence repairs, the water trough, the lumber for the north line. I can account for every day of work. Not because anyone asked me to keep track, because that's what working a piece of land looks like." Dobbs said, "What's your claim on the property?" Ethan said, "I claim the work. The land is hers." The room was quiet for a moment. Dobbs wrote it down. Clara watched him write it and felt something happen in the room's atmosphere. A small shift, barely perceptible, like the moment when a balance actually tips rather than just threatening to. Garrison stood up. "Mr. Cole, isn't it true that you previously lost a homestead claim of your own? That you have no land of your own and haven't for 2 years?" "That's true." "And isn't it reasonable to suggest that a man with no land of his own might be motivated to attach himself to someone else's?" Ethan looked at him. "It's reasonable to suggest it. I'd suggest you look at what I signed with the land attorney before the marriage filing. Property agreement, fully recorded, no claim from me during or after. I put that in writing before anything else was signed." Garrison didn't have a follow-up for that. He sat. Dobbs said, "I have a copy of that agreement here. It was in the submitted documentation." He looked at it. "You signed away any property interest before the marriage?" "Yes." "That's unusual." "We're in an unusual situation," Ethan said. That seemed like the right way to be clear about it. Dobbs looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You can sit." Ethan came back to the table. He didn't look at Clara as he sat, which meant he was maintaining the controlled stillness he needed to maintain, which she understood. She didn't look at him either. Then Dobbs said, "Mrs. Cole, I'd like to hear from you." Clara stood. She crossed to the chair and sat and looked at the examiner, and he looked back at her with that careful, neutral face. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "you've been operating this homestead since your husband's death. That's 4 months? 5 now. Before that, you were operating it alongside your husband. Before that, I was operating it alongside my husband, and in the years before he died, sometimes with fewer of his capabilities available as his health deteriorated." She said it plainly. "I know what this land requires. I've known for 8 years." The petitioner's argument includes a suggestion that a woman alone cannot sustain a frontier claim long term. How do you respond? Clara looked at him. "I'd ask what definition of long term he's using. I've sustained it through the hardest year we've had, drought in the summer, Thomas's illness in the fall, his death in the winter, and whatever Mr. Hale has been attempting since." She paused. "The ledger for the 5 months since Thomas died is here. You have it. The property didn't decline. The fence line got extended. The water trough was repaired. I found a boundary discrepancy that benefits the claim and documented it properly." She kept her voice level. I don't know what evidence would satisfy the argument that I can't do this, since the evidence I have suggests the opposite. Dobbs looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was genuinely listening, which was different from his expression during Garrison's presentation, and she'd been watching for that difference. "The marriage," he said. "Was it a practical arrangement?" "Yes." "Only that?" She thought about Annie setting Ethan's cup at the table without being asked. She thought about Luke holding the fence post in the cold. She thought about a conversation at a kitchen table at 4 a.m. over bad coffee. "At the beginning," she said, "it was practical. It's more complicated now." Dobbs wrote something. "When you say complicated, I mean my children have come to depend on him. I mean, he's been working this land with the same intention I have. I mean that what started as a legal arrangement has turned into something I wouldn't undo, even if I could." She looked at the examiner. "I can't tell you it's a conventional marriage. I can tell you it's a real one." Victor shifted at the left table. Clara didn't look at him. Dobbs said, "Thank you, you can sit." She came back to the table and sat down, and her hands were under the table, and they were doing the thing again, the shaking thing, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and waited. Dobbs spent 10 minutes looking at his documents. The room was silent except for the sound of papers and the clock. Garrison whispered something to Victor. Victor shook his head slightly. Then Dobbs looked up. "I'm not going to issue a final ruling today," he said. Garrison started to stand. Dobbs held up a hand and he stopped. "I'm not issuing a ruling today because there's one element of the documentation I want to verify through the county surveyor's office before I put anything final on record. The creek boundary question." He looked at Clara's table. "Not because I doubt the finding, because it needs to be officially ratified before it becomes part of a final ruling. That takes approximately 2 weeks. He closed his ledger. "What I will say is this." He looked between the two tables. "The question of whether Mrs. Cole has standing to maintain this claim is, in my assessment, answered by the documentation presented today. 8 years of continuous residency, documented improvements, a legal marriage on record, and a property agreement that demonstrates, unusually clearly, the intent of the parties involved." He looked at Victor directly. "The question of whether the petitioner has standing to contest the claim is substantially less clear than it appeared on paper." Victor's face didn't change, but something around his eyes did. 2 weeks, Dobbs said. "I'll have a final ruling in writing." He stood, which meant they all stood, and he gathered his papers and walked out through the side door, and the room began to move and breathe again. Garrison leaned to Victor immediately, talking low and fast. Clara watched them without turning her head, using her peripheral vision. Victor was listening and nodding, but the nod was a different kind of nod than the one he'd ridden into her yard with 6 weeks ago. It was the nod of a man adjusting, not of a man confident. Alcott touched Clara's arm. "That was as good as it could go," he said quietly. He didn't decide. He told us what his decision is going to be. He just needs the survey ratification as procedural cover. Alcott gathered his own papers. He's not going to rule against 8 years of documented work and a property agreement that's cleaner than most marriages I've seen formalized. Ethan said beside her, 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks, she said. She looked across the room. Victor was standing now, coat straightened, and he met her eyes across the space between the two tables. She expected something from his expression: contempt, recalculation, threat. She got something she hadn't expected. She got the look of a man who knew. He knew, not admitted, not conceded, not surrendering. But he knew the shape of what had happened in this room and what it meant. And for one moment that knowing was visible on his face before the professional mask came back down. He turned and walked out with Garrison behind him, and Greer behind Garrison, and the door swung shut. Luke was at Clara's shoulder. She hadn't heard him come through the bar. He was looking at the door where Victor had gone out, and then he looked at his mother. "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means we wait 2 more weeks," she said. "But what does it mean?" She looked at her son. "It means we held." He absorbed that. His jaw worked once. Thomas's jaw. Thomas's expression. "For 2 more weeks," he said, like he was confirming it was a specific amount of time and not forever. Yes, she said. And then it's done. Harmon was moving toward the door, exchanging a nod with Alcott as he passed. Daniel Sutter waited near the back and caught her eye and nodded once. Not a victory nod, just an acknowledgement. He'd done his part. Clara nodded back. They filed out into the mid-morning street. The sun was there and the town was carrying on its ordinary business around them. A cart moving past, a woman with a basket, two men talking on the steps of the hotel. And the world had not stopped for the thing that had just happened in that room, which was both a relief and slightly surreal. Ethan walked beside her, Luke on her other side, Alcott a half step behind. She didn't feel triumphant. She wasn't sure what she felt exactly. A tremendous exhaustion and something tentative underneath it that she didn't want to name yet, because 2 weeks was still 2 weeks and she'd learned that the road to winning could double back without warning. But she also felt the shape of what Ethan had said in that room. I claim the work, the land is hers. She'd expected him to defend the marriage, to explain the arrangement, to make the case for himself. Instead, he'd made the case for her. Just that, nothing more. And Dobbs had written it down. They reached the end of the main street where the road turned toward the homestead. Alcott said he'd be in touch when the survey ratification came through, and shook hands and turned back toward his office. Harmon had already gone. Sutter had his own ride south to make. The three of them, Clara, Ethan, Luke, stood at the edge of town. Luke looked up the road toward home and said, I want to check the eastern boundary markers again. They're fine, Clara said. I want to check them again, he said. She recognized that need. The need to do something physical after something emotional, to put your hands on the thing you'd been fighting for and confirm it was still there. All right, she said. They walked. The road was dry today for the first time in a while, and the air had something almost warm in it that wasn't quite warmth, but was the memory of warmth, the suggestion of spring making its argument. After a while, Ethan said, You didn't have to say that. In there. Clara looked at him. What? That it was more than practical. You didn't have to say it had become real. She walked for a moment without answering. The road turned slightly and the homestead came into view ahead. The roof, the barn, the fence line going north, the new posts standing straight where the old ones had leaned. I said what was true, she said. Dobbs might not have needed to hear it. Dobbs might not have, she said, but I needed to say it. He was quiet for several steps. Luke had moved ahead of them on the road, already focused on wherever his feet were taking him, and they were briefly behind him, just the two of them in the space between where Luke was and where the town was, and the day was around them doing what days did. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he said. After that, she stopped. She tried to figure out how to say the next part and couldn't find the shape of it. After that, things will be different. They will, he said. We don't have to know yet what different looks like. She looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead. No, she said. We don't. They kept walking. Luke was already at the fence line, already crouching to look at the posts, already doing the thing he needed to do to know it was real. Clara watched him and kept moving toward the house, and felt the 2 weeks ahead like a held breath she couldn't release quite yet. And underneath that, underneath the waiting and the exhaustion and the things she still didn't have words for, she felt the particular stubborn weight of something that hadn't been lost. Not won yet. She was careful about that distinction, but not lost. And that was something. She was beginning to think, everything. The 2 weeks did not pass quietly. Clara hadn't expected them to. She'd learned enough about Victor Hale by now to know that he didn't sit still when he was losing. But she'd hoped, maybe, for a few days of ordinary work before the next thing came. She didn't get them. The first sign was small. 3 days after the hearing, she went to the feed store and Harmon was polite but brief, and the man behind her in line, Pelton, who ran cattle on the eastern road, moved slightly when she stepped near him, the way people moved when they didn't want to be associated with something. She noticed and said nothing and bought what she needed and left. The second sign was less small. Luke came home from town on Thursday with a bruised jaw and a torn collar and told her flatly, before she could react, that it was nothing, just some boys. It was fine. She sat him down at the table and looked at his face and asked him who. He told her. 2 boys, older than him, Sons of a man named Cranston, who ran the mill operation on the North Road, and who was, Clara understood immediately, in Victor Hale's pocket, or close enough to it. "What did they say?" she asked. Luke's jaw tightened. "That we were going to lose anyway, and everyone knew it, and you'd married a drifter to try to cheat the law." Clara sat back. She kept her face controlled because Luke was watching her face to see how to feel about this, and she needed him to feel clear-headed rather than reactive. "Did you fight back?" she asked. He looked at the table. "Yes." "Did you win?" A pause. "Mostly." She almost said something about it, but she looked at his face and she didn't. He was 12, and he'd defended his family with his hands against older boys, and he'd come home and told her the truth. There were worse things. "Don't go to town alone until after the ruling," she said. "I'm not going to hide." "I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to not go alone." She looked at him. "There's a difference between standing your ground and walking into something pointlessly. You know which one your father believed in." Luke was quiet for a moment. He did know. Thomas had been a man who would stand in any doorway that needed standing in, but he'd also had the judgment to know which doorways those were. "All right," Luke said. Ethan heard about it that evening. Clara told him plainly, the way she told him things. No softening, just the facts. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "Cranston, you know him?" "Know of him. He supplies lumber to 3 operations north of town. Victor uses him." He turned his cup. "This is pressure. Not legal pressure, personal pressure. Victor's trying to make daily life uncomfortable enough that it seems easier to settle." "There's nothing to settle. The hearing's already happened." "He doesn't need you to settle legally. He needs you to want it to be over badly enough that you make a mistake. Say something publicly that can be used. Let him reframe the narrative." Ethan looked at her. "He's losing the law argument, so he's going to the one he might still win." "Which is what?" "That you're isolated. That the town has turned on you. That holding on costs more than it's worth." He paused. "Is it working?" Clara looked at him across the table. "Ask me in 10 days, she said. He almost smiled. The truth was, it was working a little, and she knew it, and she hated knowing it. The looks in town, Luke's bruised jaw, the knowledge that Victor was in people's ears, it added up to a kind of weight that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the simple human need to not be standing alone in a hostile place. She'd been managing that weight since Thomas died, and she'd gotten reasonably good at it, but good at something didn't mean it didn't cost. What she hadn't expected was the Saturday morning when Emmett Pruitt's wagon came up the road. She saw it from the garden and straightened up slowly, because Emmett hadn't been near the property since before the hearing, and she couldn't tell from a distance what the visit meant. He pulled the wagon up and climbed down. Stiffly, the way he did everything now, age and weather having made his joints their own project. And he stood in the road and held his hat in his hands and said, "I owe you an apology, Clara." She walked to the fence. She waited. "Victor's got no call to involve the Cranston boys with your son," Emmett said. "That's not a land dispute anymore. That's something else." He looked at his hat. "I'm not going to the land office. I told you that, and I meant it, and I'm sorry to say it's still true. But if you need hands for the property work before the ruling comes through, I can spare my boy Tomas on afternoons." Clara looked at him. She was trying to sort out how much of this was genuine conscience and how much was his own calculation about which way the hearing was likely to go. Whether Emmett was offering help because it was right or because he was starting to think Victor might lose and he wanted to be on the right side of that. It was probably both. That was usually how these things worked. "Tell Tomas he's welcome if he wants to come," she said. "I'm not going to ask anyone to do something that puts them sideways with Victor." "Tomas can make his own choices," Emmett said. "He's 23. "All right." Emmett put his hat back on. He looked at her. "Thomas would have fought this the loud way," he said. "You fought it smarter." He climbed back up and drove away before she could respond to that, which was probably intentional. She stood at the fence a moment and looked at the road and then went back to the garden. That afternoon, Thomas Pruitt showed up with work gloves and no explanation and spent 3 hours helping Ethan rehang the barn door that had been sitting wrong on its hinges since February. She fed him supper and he ate it, and said thank you and went home, and the next afternoon he came back. He didn't say anything about the hearing or the land office or Victor Hale. He just worked. That was its own kind of statement, and Clara received it as such. The letter came on a Tuesday, which was 12 days after the hearing, which was 2 days earlier than Dobbs had indicated. Clara was in the house when she heard the horse and went to the window and saw the land office rider, and her body understood before her mind caught up. Something tightened in her chest, and her hands went cold, and she stood very still for a moment. Then she opened the door. The rider handed her the envelope and tipped his hat and left without conversation, which was either professional neutrality or a bad sign, and she couldn't tell which. She stood in the doorway with the envelope and did not open it immediately. Ethan came around the side of the house. He saw the envelope. He stopped. She looked at him across the yard. The morning was cool and bright, and the fence post stood straight along the north line. The new wood still a different color from the old, not yet weathered, to match. She opened the envelope. She read it once, quickly, the way you read something when you're afraid of what it says, too fast to fully absorb, just trying to get to the shape of it. Then she stood still for a moment and read it again, slower. The county surveyor had ratified the creek boundary finding. The eastern property line was confirmed at the new coordinates as documented by Luke Whitmore and verified by official survey. The contested claim filed by Victor Hale was denied. The homestead at Section 14, Southeast Quarter, was confirmed in ownership to Clara Cole, née Whitmore, and her heirs. Victor Hale had 30 days to remove any pending legal actions at his own expense. Clara lowered the letter. She stood in the doorway of her house, on the land she had worked for 8 years and defended for 5 months, and she read that last line one more time because she needed to be sure she had it right. She did. "It's done," she said. Her voice came out different than she expected, quieter and rougher at the edges. "We kept it." Ethan crossed the yard. He stopped at the porch steps. He looked at her face and then at the letter, and she held it out, and he took it and read it, and when he looked up, there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not triumph, nothing like that. Something closer to relief of the specific kind that only comes when you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "It's done," he said. "Say something more useful than that." The corner of his mouth moved. "Congratulations." "Better," she said. She went inside and called for Luke, who was in the barn. He came at a run because she'd used the particular tone that meant something had happened, and he came through the door with hay on his sleeve and looked at her face. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched him read it, watched the words go in and the understanding come up, and the thing that happened on his face that she didn't have a name for but recognized as the look of a boy who'd been holding himself responsible for something and had been told he could put it down. His eyes went bright, and he looked at her and he didn't say anything. "You found the boundary," she said. "That went into the record. That was yours." He looked back at the letter. He read it a third time, which meant he was making sure. Thomas had always read important things 3 times. "Victor's really done?" he asked. "He's really done." Luke set the letter on the table very carefully, like it was something that might change if handled wrong. Then he went back out to the barn, and she let him because she understood that he needed a place to feel what he felt without his mother watching. Annie was harder to read because Annie received news with a stillness that made it difficult to know what was happening underneath. Clara sat with her that afternoon and told her plainly, the way she tried to tell her children things. Not simplified, not dramatized, just true. Annie listened. She was quiet for a moment. "So Ethan doesn't have to stay now," she said. Clara looked at her. "What?" "He came to help keep the land. The land is kept." She said it with the logical precision of a child who had been doing her own accounting. "So he doesn't have to stay." Clara was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "He doesn't have to." Annie looked at her. "But you want him to." It was not a question. It was a 9-year-old stating what she had observed, because Annie had been observing since the first night Ethan sat at their table, and she had been drawing conclusions with the quiet efficiency that was entirely her own. "Annie, I want him to," Annie said, flatly, as a fact being entered into evidence. Then she got up and went to find her brother, and Clara sat at the table with the ruling letter in front of her and thought about what it meant to have a daughter who said the true thing out loud when everyone else was still finding their way around to it. She found Ethan at the north fence line that evening. He was walking it, not working it, just walking, looking at the posts, looking at where the land went. She'd seen him do this before, in the first weeks. She'd thought then that it was the habit of a man who'd lost land and couldn't stop taking inventory of what he was standing on. She walked out to him. The light was going long and flat across the grass, and the air had enough warmth in it now to suggest that spring wasn't a suggestion anymore. She walked up beside him, and they stood at the fence and looked north at the land together. "The property agreement," she said. "The one you signed before the filing. What about it?" "It says you're free to go." She looked at the fence post nearest her. "The land is confirmed. The reason for the arrangement is resolved." Ethan was quiet. "I'm not asking you to go," she said. "I need to be clear about that. I'm telling you the agreement releases you. What you do with that is your choice." He turned to look at her. She kept looking at the fence post. "Clara," he said. "Don't say something easy," she said. "I've had enough easy things said to me in my life, and none of them turned out to be true. If you're going to say something, say the real thing." He was quiet for long enough that she finally turned to look at him. His face was doing the thing it did when he was being exact. "The real thing," he said, "is that I came here because I understood what was being taken from you, and I didn't want to watch it happen. That was all it was at the start. And now? Now I wake up in the morning and I know what needs doing before I've had coffee, and that's because I've been here long enough that this place is in me the way places get into you when you're not paying attention." He looked at her steadily. "And I sit at that table every night, and there are people there, and the people matter. Not because of any arrangement, because they do." She looked at him. "That's a careful way of saying something." "I'm a careful man." "I know," she said. "I've noticed." The wind moved through the grass along the fence line. Somewhere in the barn, Dunn shifted. "I'm not the same person Thomas married," she said. "I'm not trying to be. What happened this year changed me, and I don't think I'm going back to who I was before all of it." She looked at the land, her land, their land, the land that was now on paper what it had always been in fact. "I don't know what I'm offering you. I'm being honest about that. I know what I have, this place, these children, more work than two people can probably finish, and a disposition that I've been told is not the easiest thing to live alongside." "Who told you that?" "Thomas." Affectionately, but still. His mouth moved, almost a smile. "I don't need easy," he said. "You should know what you're staying for if you stay." "I know what I'm staying for?" He said it simply, without decoration. "I'm staying because this is where the work is that means something, and because you don't need me to stay, which is the only situation where staying is worth anything." She looked at him for a long moment. "The barn loft," she said. He blinked. "It's cold and the ladder is awkward, and there's no reason for it now," she said. "There's a room off the kitchen that Thomas used as a study. It's full of boxes, but the boxes can be moved." She held his gaze. "I'm not saying more than that right now. I'm saying the loft is no place to spend another winter, and there's a room that isn't being used." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They walked back to the house. The light was almost gone, and the house had its lamp burning in the kitchen window, and through the window she could see Luke and Annie at the table doing their evening reading. The ordinary scene of it, so ordinary, so exactly like 1,000 evenings before this one, and hopefully 1,000 after, made something catch in her throat that she didn't let out. She'd almost lost this. She needed to remember that without letting it undo her. That was the balance, holding the knowledge of how close the loss had been without letting it make you afraid to live in what you'd managed to keep. Victor Hale left the territory 6 weeks later. Clara heard it from Alcott, who heard it from the county clerk, who had processed the withdrawal of Victor's remaining business interests in the area. He didn't come to say goodbye. He didn't send word. He simply ceased to be a presence, which was its own kind of answer to the question of what he'd really wanted. Not the land itself, not the memory of his brother, not any genuine family claim, but the victory of taking something because he could. When the taking became impossible, the interest evaporated. She felt almost nothing about it. She'd expected to feel more relief, perhaps, or satisfaction, or the particular exhausted gladness of a long thing being over. What she felt was closer to quiet. The noise that had been in her life for 5 months simply stopped, and what was left in the absence of it was just her life, which was enough and had always been enough, and was now, piece by piece, becoming something she could look at without accounting for what was missing. Emmett Pruitt came by the week after Victor left. He brought a bushel of early vegetables from his wife's garden and stood at the fence and said, without preamble, "Heard Hale's gone." "I heard that too," Clara said. He nodded. "Good riddance." He handed over the vegetables and looked at the fence line and said, "Those posts are straight." "They are. Good wood." "Good work," she said. He left, and that was all either of them said about the things they hadn't said for 5 months, and that was sufficient. The summer that followed was not an easy one. Clara would say that clearly to anyone who asked, though she found later that nobody quite asked. What people saw from the outside was a homestead that was running, crops in, fence holding, family present, and they concluded from that things had worked out. They had, but working out and being easy were not the same category of thing, and Clara had spent too much of her life conflating them to keep making that mistake. There were days when the work was too much, days when something broke at the wrong time, or the weather turned wrong, or the numbers in the ledger didn't add the way they needed to, and she sat at the table after the children were asleep and felt the weight of it without anyone to put half of it on. Except that wasn't quite right anymore. Ethan moved into the study room in May, once the boxes were shifted and the room had been cleared and a cot that became a proper bed by July had been moved in. He was quiet about the moving of the boxes. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He just shifted his things from the loft, the bedroll, the canvas bag, the rifle, the small tin of tools, and they were downstairs, and that was that. They were not, that summer, more than what they were. Clara was clear-eyed about what they were building and at what pace, and Ethan was patient in the way he was patient about all things. Not passively, not just waiting, but present and working while the thing developed at the speed it needed to develop. There were evenings when they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed and talked, really talked, the kind of conversation that had nothing to do with ledgers or hearings or fence posts. And those evenings were the ones she filed away in the place she was keeping for the things she wanted to remember. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn things about a careful man. He'd grown up in Ohio, the second of 4 sons, on a farm that went under when he was 15. He'd come west at 19 looking for the thing a lot of men came west looking for. The piece of ground that was genuinely his, that he'd made mean something. He'd found it and lost it and not stopped believing it was possible to find again. That last part was the thing she turned over in her mind more than once. She'd half expected, underneath his calm, to find a man who'd made a settlement with loss. Instead, she found a man who had not. "You still believe you'll have land of your own," she said one evening in August, not quite a question. He looked at the middle distance. "I believe in work and what it builds," he said. "I don't need my name to be the only name on it." She looked at him. He was looking at the property, at the fence line going north, at the barn, at the land going east to where the creek bent now at its true place. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "What we have here, what we're building." She stopped. She was still learning how to say the things she meant directly rather than through implication, which was harder than it sounded. "I don't want you to be a man working someone else's land. I never wanted that." "Clara, I'm not finished." She looked at him. "The property agreement we signed, it was right for what it was. But it's not what this is anymore, and I think we both know that." She paused. "I want to talk to Alcott about amending it." He was very still. "Not changing ownership," she said. "Not changing what the children inherit, but acknowledging that this is a partnership. On paper, the way it already is in practice." He looked at her for a long moment. The evening was going quiet around them, the kind of quiet that only the land made at that hour when the work was done. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to." He was quiet again. Then, "Is that what you want?" "I just said it, didn't I?" "You said you wanted to talk to Alcott about it." "Which is how I do things when I want them," she said. "I make sure they're done correctly." He looked at her, and something in his face settled. Not into relief exactly, but into a kind of landing, the particular quality of a thing arriving at the place it was headed. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Annie, who was supposed to be in bed and was not, appeared in the porch doorway at this moment, which was either terrible timing or perfect timing, depending on how you looked at it. "I heard talking," she said. "You were supposed to be asleep," Clara said. "I was almost asleep." Annie looked between them. She was 9 years old, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness and a perceptiveness that neither parent could fully account for. "Are you two going to stop talking around things now?" Ethan made a sound. Not quite a laugh, the closest thing to one she'd heard from him. "Go to bed, Annie," Clara said. "I'm just asking." "Bed!" Annie looked at Ethan. He looked back at her with the expression he'd perfected. Serious, attentive, not giving her anything to work with. She exhaled like someone twice her age dealing with unreasonable people and went back inside. Clara and Ethan sat for a moment in the silence she'd left behind. "She's going to be formidable," Ethan said. "She already is," Clara said. "I just haven't told her yet." She went to Alcott's office the following week. She told him what she wanted, and he listened with his hands flat on the desk, and then he said, "This is going to be a more conventional document than the last one." "I know." "The previous agreement was specifically designed to protect your sole ownership. Amending it will require—" "I know what it requires," she said. "I want it done right. That's why I'm here." He looked at her over his spectacles with the expression she'd come to understand meant he approved, but wasn't going to say so directly. "I'll have a draft by Thursday." "Thank you." She walked out into the late summer street and stood for a moment in the sun that was still warm enough to mean something. The town looked the same as it always had, the feed store, the hotel, the dry goods. But she was standing in it differently than she'd stood in it a year ago. She'd stood in it then as a woman alone with a contested claim and $11.40 and a tin box under the floorboard. She stood in it now as a woman who had fought for what was hers and won, and who was choosing, with clear eyes and without desperation, what came next. That was the difference. It was all the difference. There was a lesson in that. She'd been turning it over all summer, the shape of it. The lesson wasn't that fighting was enough, or that having the right papers was enough, or even that having the right people beside you was enough, though all of those things had mattered. The lesson was something smaller and harder to say, that the thing people tried to take from you, what they were really after, was never just the property or the money or the legal standing. It was your belief that you deserved it. Victor had never needed the land office to rule in his favor. He'd needed her to decide that she wasn't worth the fight. She hadn't. And that had been the whole thing, in the end. Not the ledgers, not Alcott, not Ethan's name on a piece of paper, though all of those mattered, concretely and genuinely. But underneath all of it was a woman who stood on the porch steps while a man on a gray horse tried to use her grief and her isolation and her gender as arguments against her existence on land she had earned, and she had decided in that moment that she was not going to agree. That was the choice. It was made before any of the rest of it, and all of the rest of it grew from it. She thought about the women she knew who hadn't made that choice, not from weakness, but from exhaustion, from legitimate calculation that the fight would cost more than they had. She didn't judge them. She understood more than she wanted to how the math could work out that way. The arithmetic of going up against a man with money and influence and a legal system that had been built with him in mind was not simple arithmetic, and there was no shame in running those numbers and arriving at a hard answer. But she also knew, standing in the sun on the main street of Burnt Creek with the late summer going golden around her, that she would make the same choice again, every time. Even without Ethan, even without Alcott, even with only $11.40 in Thomas's ledger and the stubborn, inconvenient refusal to accept someone else's story about what she was capable of. She would make the same choice, because some ground you don't surrender. Not because you're certain you'll win, but because it's yours, and you know it's yours. and no one else's certainty to the contrary changes that fact. She walked home. By the time the leaves turned that fall, things at the homestead had taken on a quality that Clara could only describe privately as settled. Not finished. Nothing about frontier life was ever finished, and she'd made her peace with that long ago. But settled in the way that a house became a home, not through any single moment, but through the accumulation of ordinary days that had occurred there. Luke was 13 now and managing the eastern fence line with a competence that she recognized was no longer a boy's competence. He and Ethan had a working rhythm that had developed over the summer into something she could not have engineered. Two people who moved around each other on a shared task without needing to negotiate each step. She watched them sometimes from the kitchen window and thought of Thomas, not with grief exactly, but with the specific bittersweet awareness that love didn't end when a person did. It just changed shape and found new containers. Annie had decided sometime in September that Dunn was a good name after all. She told Ethan this seriously one morning over breakfast, as if issuing a revised opinion. Ethan received it with the gravity it deserved and said he'd be sure to let Dunn know. Annie nodded and went back to her porridge. Clara watched this exchange and felt something so ordinary and complete that she didn't try to name it. The amended property agreement was signed in October on a Thursday morning in Alcott's office, with Harmon witnessing again because he was there, and he didn't ask questions, and Clara had developed a fondness for those qualities in a person. The document established a partnership in the operation of the homestead while preserving the inheritance structure for Luke and Annie. Ethan signed it without ceremony. Clara signed it without ceremony. They shook Alcott's hand and walked out. On the street, Ethan said, "Same as before?" She looked at him. "What?" "Last time we signed papers in there, I asked if you were all right, and you said, 'Ask me in 30 days.'" She thought about it. The autumn was around them, cool and clear, the leaves doing what they did in October out here, turning colors that seemed too bright to be real and then being completely real. "I'm all right now," she said. He looked at her. "Not in 30 days?" "Now," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that stillness she'd learned to read as its own kind of language, and then he said, "All right." They walked home together on the road they had walked many times before, past the fence line where the new post stood weathered now to match the old, past the barn where Dunn watched them from the paddock with the mild indifference of a horse who had decided the situation required nothing further from him, past the garden that was put to bed for winter, past the well Thomas had dug in the second year. The house was there at the end of the road, where it had always been. Clara walked toward it. The land was hers. It had always been hers, and the life she was building on it, imperfect, unfinished, marked by loss and stubbornness and the particular grace of people choosing each other without being required to, that was hers too. She had kept it. That was everything.